Continuing King Arthur and His Knights by Elizabeth Lodor Merchant. The Sword Excalibur. Guinevere turned from her father to the stranger knight. Then the Lord Chamberlain rode up with 2 new unbroken spears, and the 2 brave warriors met again, with even a louder crash than before. And my stomach rumbles as they say crash, as I read crash. Again, each spear was shattered to bits. By this time both king and knight were hot with battle, and springing from their horses, they rushed at each other on foot, brandishing their sharp, shining swords. Over and over again they struck, one at the other, each trying to strike the conquering blow. At last the stranger knight drew back for a moment, and King Arthur, thinking he was exhausted, leaping towards him. But the other swung a sword suddenly high above his head, and brought it with all his force against the king's sword. As Arthur made his spring, so violent was the knight's great blow that it cut right through the sword of the king, who was left with only the jagged handle in his grasp. Then Arthur threw away the handle and rushed at the knight with his mailed gloves. So they fought again, rocking and swaying together like 2 mighty wrestlers. But at last King Arthur was thrown to the ground and lay senseless among the bruised ferns and crushed wild flowers of the forest floor. The stranger knight lifted high his own unbroken sword. Whether or not to strike the fainting king, none ever knew, for Merlin, who had been watching, sprang forward and waved his wizard's wand. The knight slipped slowly to the ground and lay beside the king in a deep sleep, while Merlin lifted Arthur and set him, only half conscious, on the stranger's horse. The king, pale and exhausted, looked down on the knight as Merlin led the horse away. "O Merlin, Merlin," he cried, "you have killed the finest knight that ever did battle against a king." "Not so," answered Merlin, "he is only asleep, and it is a good thing for you he is not awake. But come, you must have another sword to make up for the one that has been broken in the fight." So on they went through the trees, Merlin still leading the horse. Presently they came to a big open space in the forest, and there, in the afternoon sunlight, glimmered the wide waters of a mysterious lake. Nothing was in sight, no cottages, no castles, no people, no wild foxes or deer, but out in the middle of the lake a white hand and arm were stretched out from the water, as motionless as if they were carved in ivory. A long sleeve of pearly satin was folded about the arm, and the slender hand held the most beautiful jeweled sword that Arthur had ever seen. You know, the Golden Dawn images of the tarot were not exactly unique, with this hand stretching forth for no... I mean, why is there a hand there? But we can say it represents something, or perhaps the spiritual realms were only partially revealed. As the king looked amazed, he saw a golden-haired fairy maiden in a silver gown, walking on the green water, just as a pretty girl might trip across a green meadow. She came stepping daintily towards them, and Arthur asked Merlin who she was. "She is Nimue, the Lady of the Lake," said Merlin. "And if you ask her very courteously, she will tell you how to get the sword." So when the Lady of the Lake set her pretty little foot on the shore, Arthur went towards her, bowing very low. asking her to tell him how he might get the sword. Then the maiden smiled and showed him a fairy barge, snugly hidden among the reeds and rushes. She told him he had but to get into that barge, row himself into the middle of the lake, and take the sword out of the fair white hand which held it. And, as my reward for telling you this, said she, one day I shall come to the court and claim a favor from you. Then she disappeared, and Arthur and Merlin, springing into the barge, rowed out in the middle of the lake as fast as they could. When people ask favors, but you don't have to know what they are, just like promises, once you realize you were wrong in making a promise, it's good to keep your word, but not so good that you're going to sin or whatever. All this time, the hand and arm that held the sword had remained quite still. How strange they looked, rising so mysteriously from the quiet, glimmering water. How Arthur marveled, as he drew nearer and nearer, at the slim wrist and the delicate fingers of that white, strange hand. What lady or fairy could it be who lived under the waves of that wonderful mirror and was offering this beautiful jeweled gift to a human king? The barge grew close up to the motionless arm, and Arthur, leaning over the side, put out his hand. Very gently and carefully he drew the shining sword from the fairy fingers. As soon as he touched the sword, they released their clasp, and the arm sank slowly, slowly down into the lake. The ripples closed over it with a little murmur, and it was gone. And Arthur, when he examined the sword, saw that on one side of the blade the words, "Take me," were engraved, and that on the other side appeared the legend, "Cast me away." When he had read these words, he became very sad, but Merlin said, "Take the sword and make good use of it, for the time when you will have to cast it away is very far off." Because the sword's a symbol of distinction, so. Then Merlin rowed the barge back again to the rocky, reedy bank of the lake. The lady who had told them to take the sword was nowhere to be seen. She had disappeared entirely, and had not left so much as a glimmer of her silver gown, or a gleam of her golden hair among the dark pines that grew close down to the water's edge. Arthur and Merlin stepped out of the barge, and Arthur fastened the fairy sword to his side. Then Merlin, who had read all about it in one of his fairy books, told him that the sword was called Excalibur, and that it was just as precious and wonderful as the round table itself. The wizard told the king, too, the name of this stranger knight, which was Pellinore, and said that he also was a great king. But when Arthur wanted to go and finish the battle with Pellinore, now that he was armed with the fairy sword, Merlin said that he had fought quite enough for one day, so he and the king rode back to Caerleon with Excalibur hanging by Arthur's side, while King Pellinore awoke quietly from his enchanted sleep and went to rest in his tent, hung with silken curtains and golden tassels that he had set up by the side of the fern-fringed fountain in the shade of the forest trees. Now, we can say that's symbolic, but there were kings who went to war with gold and silk and all that stuff, and but it kind of says, "Over here, target. If you make your way to here, you will get more than killing any 10 or whatever of other people." So, leading the charge, people would notice by pattern, but it shouldn't be like a big old target sign.